The sun was just beginning to peek over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange as James Wilson stepped out onto his front porch. The wooden boards creaked beneath his weathered work boots, a familiar sound that had greeted him nearly every morning for the past 30 years. He breathed in deeply, filling his lungs with the crisp morning air that carried the sweet scent of soil and growing things. This was his favorite time of day, when the world felt new and full of promise. At 54, James's face told the story of a life lived outdoors, deep laugh lines around his eyes, skin darkened and toughened by years under the Georgia sun, and a salt and pepper beard he kept neatly trimmed. His large hands, calloused and strong, were those of a man who knew hard work intimately. He flexed them now, working out the morning stiffness that seemed to get a little worse each year. Another day, another dollar, he murmured to himself, a saying his grandfather had used every morning. The older man had taught James everything he knew about farming, passing down knowledge that had sustained their family for 3 generations on this land. James stepped back inside his modest farmhouse to grab the thermos of coffee his wife Darlene had prepared before, leaving for her early shift at the local hospital. 28 years of marriage, and she still made sure he had hot coffee waiting even when she had to be out the door before him. He smiled at the thought of her, still the same warm smile, and kind eyes that had caught his attention at a church picnic all those years ago. The kitchen walls were lined with photos chronicling their life. Together, their wedding day, the birth of their 2 children, graduations, and countless family gatherings around this very table. Now their son was off at college studying agricultural science, hoping to bring new ideas back to the family farm, while their daughter had just started her nursing career, following in her mother's footsteps. As he walked out to his truck, an old Ford that had seen better days but still ran reliably enough, James's mind turned to the day ahead. There were fence repairs needed on the north pasture, irrigation issues to sort out for the summer crops, and he needed to check on the pregnant cow that looked ready to deliver any day now. The mental to-do list was always long, the work never ending. The farm had been struggling in recent years. Rising costs of equipment, seed, and fertilizer, combined with increasingly unpredictable weather patterns, had squeezed their profit margins razor thin. Last summer's drought had hit them hard, and the bank loan they'd taken out to get through it hung over his head like a storm cloud. One day at a time, James reminded himself as he climbed into the truck cab, the springs of the seat groaning under his weight. He set his thermos in the cup holder, turned the key, and the engine rumbled to life. The radio automatically came on, tuned to the local country station. A weather report promised another beautiful spring day, with temperatures in the mid-70s and clear skies. Perfect farming weather. James drove slowly along the dirt road that wound through his property, 80 acres that had been in the Wilson family since his grandfather purchased it in 1945, after returning from World War II. Every tree, every curve in the land was familiar to him. He knew where the soil drained well and where it held water too long, which sections caught the best morning light, and which were sheltered from the harshest winds. The beauty of the place never failed to stir something deep in his soul. The sun, now higher in the sky, cast golden light across fields of young corn, their green shoots reaching hopefully toward the heavens. A small herd of cattle grazed peacefully in a pasture to the left, their black coats glossy in the morning light. Beyond them, a stand of pecan. Trees his grandfather had planted formed a protective border along the property line. James took a sip of his coffee as he approached the main road that separated his farm from his neighbors. He needed to check on a section of fence that bordered the county road, where he'd noticed some damage last week. The truck bounced along the uneven farm track, the familiar motion as comforting as a rocking chair. As he neared the main road, something caught his eye. Fresh gouges in the asphalt and broken glass glinting in the sunlight. James slowed the truck, frowning as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Then his gaze followed the skid marks to the edge of the road where the guardrail was bent and partially torn away. "Lord have mercy," he breathed, immediately pulling over and putting on his hazard lights. It looked like someone had gone off the road, and from the damage to the guardrail they'd been moving fast. He grabbed his phone from his pocket and stepped out of the truck, moving quickly to the edge of the embankment. Looking down the steep slope, James's heart dropped. About 30 feet below, partially hidden by dense underbrush and young trees, was a car. A fancy one by the looks of it, though it was hard to tell with the damage. The sleek silver vehicle was crumpled against a large oak tree, its hood accordioned back toward the windshield. A thin trail of smoke rose from the engine compartment. Without hesitation, James began making his way down the slope, his boots sliding on the loose dirt and leaves. The incline was steep enough that he had to grab onto saplings and branches to keep from falling. His knee, which had been giving him trouble since he'd injured it helping a neighboring farm after a tornado 2 years back, protested sharply, but he ignored the pain. "Hello? Anybody down there?" he called out as he neared the wreckage.
"Can you hear me?"
There was no response. As he got closer, James could see that the car was even more damaged than it had appeared from above. It was some kind of luxury vehicle, with leather seats visible through the shattered side window. The driver's side had taken the brunt of the impact, crumpled in where it had hit the tree. Through the cracked windshield, James could make out a figure slumped forward against deployed airbags. A man, from what he could tell, wearing what looked like a suit. He wasn't moving. "Sir, can you hear me?" James called again, his voice louder now as adrenaline coursed through his system. He tried the passenger door, finding it stuck but not locked. Putting his shoulder into it, he pushed hard until it gave way with a groan of protesting metal. The interior of the car smelled of burned electronics, airbag powder, and something else, the metallic scent of blood. The driver was an older white man, perhaps in his 60s, with silver hair and an expensive-looking watch on his wrist. His face was turned away, pressed against the side window, but James could see a nasty cut on his forehead that was bleeding freely. "Sir, I'm going to help you," James said, though he wasn't sure if the man could hear him. He reached across carefully, checking for a pulse at the man's neck. It was there, weak but steady. Thank God. James pulled out his phone to call 911, but cursed under his breath when he saw there was no signal. This stretch of road was notorious for poor reception. He'd have to get back up to the road to make the call, but first he needed to check if it was safe to leave the injured man. The smoke from the engine was concerning, and there was a strong smell of gasoline. If there was a fire, the car could go up in flames within minutes. Making a quick decision, James decided he needed to get the man out. Working carefully but quickly, he reached across to unbuckle the seatbelt. The man groaned faintly, the first sign that he was alive beyond the pulse James had felt. "I'm going to get you out of here, sir. Help is coming," James assured him, though he knew the man probably couldn't understand him. The dashboard had been pushed inward, pinning the man's legs. The steering wheel had been shoved down by the airbag, pressing against his chest. James knew enough about car accidents to be careful of neck and spine injuries, but the growing smell of gasoline made him more worried about fire. Using all his strength, he managed to push the seat back slightly, creating just enough space to work the man free. With gentle but firm movements, James eased the unconscious man toward him, supporting his head and neck as best he could. It was awkward and difficult, but years of lifting hay bales and calves had given James strength that served him well now. Finally, he had the man out of the car and lying on the ground a safe distance away. Now he could see his face clearly, distinguished features, likely handsome when not marred by the accident. His suit, though torn and bloodied now, was clearly expensive. There was a platinum wedding band on his left hand and a watch that probably cost more than James made in a year. But none of that mattered now. All James saw was a human being in desperate need of help. He quickly checked the man over for obvious injuries beyond the cut on his head. There was some blood seeping through the suit pants on his right leg, and his breathing seemed labored, suggesting possible broken ribs. "I need to get help. I'll be right back," James said. Though he knew the man couldn't hear him, it was as much to reassure himself as anything else. The climb back up to the road was harder than the descent had been, especially with his knee throbbing in protest. By the time he reached his truck, James was breathing hard, sweat soaking through his work shirt despite the cool morning air. He grabbed his phone, relieved to see he had signal again, and dialed 911. As he waited for the operator to answer, his eyes remained fixed on the wreckage below, worried about the man he'd left lying there, alone and injured in the woods. "1, what's your emergency?" "There's been a car accident," James began, his deep voice steady despite his racing heart. "On County Road 27, about 2 miles east of the Johnson Creek Bridge. A car went off the road. There's one person injured, adult male. unconscious with head trauma. As he spoke, giving all the details he could, James Wilson had no idea that this morning, which had started like any other on his struggling family farm, was about to change his life forever. James pocketed his phone after finishing the call with 911. The operator had promised that help was on the way, but out here in the countryside, it would take at least 15 minutes for the first responders to arrive. He looked back down the steep embankment where the injured man lay unconscious beside the smoking wreck. Something didn't feel right about leaving him there alone. Can't just stand here waiting, James muttered to himself, already making his way back down the slope. His work boots slid on the loose dirt as he carefully picked his path, grabbing onto small trees for balance. His knee screamed in protest with each step, but he pushed the pain aside. As he reached the bottom, James noticed the smoke from the car's engine had thickened. The smell of gasoline was stronger now, too, making his decision to move the man seem even more necessary. He knelt beside the unconscious stranger, checking again for a pulse. It was still there, perhaps a bit stronger than before. "Help's coming, sir," James said, his voice gentle but firm. "Just hang in there." The man's eyelids fluttered slightly and a low groan escaped his lips. His expensive suit was torn and dirty now, the white shirt underneath stained with blood from the cut on his forehead. Up close, James could see he was older than he'd first thought, maybe in his late 60s, with deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth. His silver hair, though matted with blood on one side, was neatly cut in a style that spoke of regular visits to high-end barbers. A sudden popping sound from the car made James jerk his head up. The smoke was darker now, and small flames had appeared around the crumpled hood. His heart rate quickened. "We need to move further away," James said, though he knew the man couldn't understand him. He looked up the steep embankment, realizing there was no way he could carry the injured man up that slope by himself, especially with his bad knee. Instead, James decided to move him further along the bottom of the ravine, away from the car but still visible from the road. Careful to support the man's head and neck in case of spinal injuries, James lifted him as gently as possible. Years of farm work had made James strong, but the dead weight of an unconscious man was still a challenge. Gritting his teeth against the strain, he began carrying him away from the increasingly dangerous wreck. The man was surprisingly heavy for his size. Sweat beaded on James's forehead as he carefully picked his way through the underbrush, trying to avoid jostling his injured passenger. After moving about 50 yards away, far enough to be safe if the car exploded, James gently laid the man down in a small clearing where they would be visible from the road. As if responding to the movement, the stranger's eyes fluttered open briefly. They were a pale blue, clouded with confusion and pain. What happened?" he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "You were in an accident," James explained, kneeling beside him. "Your car went off the road. An ambulance is coming." The man tried to focus on James's face, but his eyes kept drifting closed. Thank you," he whispered before slipping back into unconsciousness. James took off his flannel overshirt and folded it carefully, placing it under the man's head as a makeshift pillow. Then he removed his clean handkerchief from his pocket. Darlene insisted he always carry one, and pressed it gently against the bleeding cut on the stranger's forehead. In the distance, James could hear sirens approaching. Relief washed over him. He kept the pressure on the wound, his eyes constantly moving between the injured man's face and the burning car, which was now fully engulfed in flames. Black smoke billowed into the morning sky, creating a stark contrast against the peaceful blue. "Almost here," James assured the unconscious man, though the words were more for his own comfort. The sirens grew louder, and soon James could see flashing lights on the road above. He raised his free arm and waved, calling out, "Down here! We're down here!" The next few minutes passed in a blur of activity. Paramedics made their way down the slope with a rescue basket and medical equipment. A firefighter team focused on the burning vehicle. James stepped back, suddenly feeling the adrenaline that had been keeping him going start to ebb away, replaced by the throbbing pain in his knee and a bone-deep tiredness. A young female paramedic approached him while her colleagues worked on stabilizing the injured man. "You the one who pulled him out?" she asked, her eyes quickly assessing James for injuries. He nodded. "Found the wreck on my way to check fences. Car started smoking, so I got him out and called 911. "Good thing you came along when you did," she said, glancing back at the burning luxury car. "He wouldn't have survived that." As they watched, the paramedics carefully secured the man's neck with a brace and transferred him to the rescue basket. The stranger remained unconscious, an oxygen mask now covering his face, IVs running into his arms. "You hurt yourself?" the paramedic asked, noticing how James was favoring his right leg. "Old injury," he explained. "Aggravated it on the slope." She nodded. "You should get it looked at. Want to come in the ambulance? Hospital's not far." James shook his head. "Got work to do on the farm." "I'll be fine." A police officer approached, notebook in hand. "Need to ask you a few questions, sir, if you don't mind." James answered everything as clearly as he could, describing how he'd found the accident and what he'd done. The officer seemed particularly interested in the car. "Bentley Continental GT, he said, whistling low. $150,000 minimum. Driver must be someone important," James shrugged. He hadn't recognized the car model or the man. Didn't find a wallet or anything. He was pretty out of it, only spoke a couple words. After finishing with the police, James watched as they carefully carried the injured man up the embankment in the rescue basket. It took 4 people, working together with ropes and careful coordination to get him safely to the top. The effort made James realize just how difficult his solo rescue had been. One of the firefighters approached James as he prepared to climb back up to his truck. "You really carried him out of that wreck by yourself?" he asked, eyebrows raised. James nodded modestly. "Didn't have much choice. Car was smoking pretty bad." The firefighter clapped him on the shoulder. "That's something else, man. Not everyone would stop, let alone do what you did." He glanced at the now fully engulfed luxury car. Saved his life, no question. James felt uncomfortable with the praise. "Just did what needed doing," he said simply. Anyone would have. But as he climbed back up to the road, wincing at each painful step, James knew that wasn't entirely true. How many cars had passed by before he'd come along? The accident site wasn't easily visible from the road unless you were looking for it. And people were often in too much of a hurry these days to notice things that didn't directly concern them. By the time he reached his truck, the ambulance was already pulling away, sirens blaring as it rushed toward the county hospital 20 miles away. The fire truck remained, the crew working to extinguish the car fire before it could spread to the surrounding woods. James sat heavily in the driver's seat, suddenly aware of how his hands were trembling in the aftermath of the adrenaline rush. He took a moment to breathe deeply, trying to process everything that had happened in the last hour. What had started as a normal morning on his farm had turned into something he'd never expected. He thought about the injured man, his expensive clothes, the luxury car, the platinum wedding band. Someone would be worried about him. A wife, perhaps, children, colleagues. Did they know yet that he was hurt? Were they frantically trying to reach him, wondering why he wasn't answering his phone? James reached for his thermos of coffee, surprised to find it still warm. It felt like hours had passed, but his watch showed it had been less than an hour since he'd discovered the accident. He took a long drink, the familiar taste helping to settle his nerves. A tapping on his window startled him. It was the police officer from before. "Sorry to bother you again, sir, but we found this in the wreckage," he said, holding up a slightly singed leather wallet. "Need to notify next of kin." "Thought you might want to know who you saved." James nodded, curious despite himself. The officer flipped open the wallet to show a driver's license. "Name's Richard Harrington." "Mean anything to you?" James shook his head. "Well, it should," the officer said, looking impressed. "Richard Harrington, founder of Harrington Tech, billionaire, one of the richest men in the country." James blinked, the information not quite registering. The name sounded vaguely familiar, maybe from the news, but he couldn't place it. "You saved a billionaire today, Mr. Wilson," the officer continued, clearly more excited by this fact than James was. "Could be a reward in it for you. These types, they can be generous when someone helps them out." James frowned slightly. "Didn't do it for a reward," he said, his tone making it clear the suggestion bothered him. "Would have done the same for anyone." The officer looked slightly abashed. "Course you would. Just saying it might come back to you in a good way." He pocketed the wallet. "We'll need a statement from you later, but it can wait till tomorrow if that works better." James nodded, eager to get back to his farm duties, already hours behind schedule. As the officer walked away, James started his truck, the engine rumbling to life. He sat there for a moment, hands on the wheel, still trying to process what had happened. A billionaire. The thought was almost laughable. What were the chances? But as he put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the road, James realized it didn't really matter who the man was or how much money he had. All that mattered was that he was alive, and with luck, he'd stay that way. The day stretched ahead, full of the same farm tasks that had been waiting before this unexpected detour. The fence still needed fixing. The pregnant cow still needed checking. The irrigation issues wouldn't solve themselves. Life went on. Billionaire rescue or no billionaire rescue. Yet as James drove back toward his fields, he couldn't help but wonder if he'd ever hear what happened to Richard Harrington. Probably not, he decided. Their worlds were too different, their paths crossing only by the strangest of chances on this otherwise ordinary spring morning. 3 days had passed since James pulled Richard Harrington from the burning wreck. Life on the farm continued as it always did. The rhythm of chores, the needs of the animals, and the demands of the growing season waited for no one. James had checked the local news once or twice for updates on the billionaire's condition, but there was surprisingly little information available. A brief mention of a single vehicle accident, and that the driver was in stable condition, but nothing more. James was in the barn, repairing a broken tractor part, when his wife Darlene's voice called out to him from the farmhouse. Even at this distance, he could tell something was up from her tone. "James! Phone call for you." He wiped his greasy hands on a rag and walked toward the house, puzzled. Most people called his cell phone these days, not the landline. Only telemarketers and his mother-in-law regularly used the house number. Darlene met him at the kitchen door, her eyes wide with excitement. "It's the hospital," she whispered, holding out the cordless phone. "Something about that man you helped?" James took the phone, suddenly concerned. Had something happened? Had the man Harrington taken a turn for the worse? "Hello, this is James Wilson," he said, his deep voice cautious. "Mr. Wilson, this is Nurse Chen from County General Hospital," came a friendly female voice. "I'm calling on behalf of one of our patients, Mr. Richard Harrington. He's been asking to speak with the man who rescued him from his accident." James raised his eyebrows in surprise. "He's doing all right then?" "Much better, yes. He's still in recovery, but he's awake and alert now. He was quite insistent about reaching you." There was a smile in her voice. "He'd very much like you to visit him if you're willing." James hadn't expected this. He looked at Darlene, who was watching him curiously, unable to hear the other side of the conversation. "Well, James hesitated. The farm needed his attention, and hospitals made him uncomfortable. But something about refusing to visit a man whose life he'd saved didn't sit right with him. "When would be a good time?" "Any time today or tomorrow would be fine. Mr. Harrington is in a private room and can have visitors whenever it's convenient for them." After ending the call, James explained the situation to Darlene. Her response was immediate. "You have to go, James. The man wants to thank you." "Got work to do here," he protested, but it was half-hearted. Darlene put her hands on her hips in a stance he knew all too well after nearly 3 decades of marriage. "The farm will survive without you for a few hours. That fence has been broken for 3 weeks already. Another day won't make a difference." And so, 2 hours later, James found himself walking through the sliding doors of County General Hospital, feeling distinctly out of place. He'd changed out of his work clothes into what Darlene called his Sunday best: clean jeans, a button-up shirt, and his least scuffed boots. He'd even trimmed his beard, though he'd drawn the line at the tie Darlene had suggested. At the reception desk, a young woman looked up from her computer. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Richard Harrington," James said, still feeling strange about the whole situation. "I'm James Wilson. I believe they're expecting me." The receptionist's eyes widened slightly. "Oh, Mr. Wilson, yes. Let me call up to Mr. Harrington's floor." After a brief phone conversation, she smiled at James. "Someone will be down to escort you up. Mr. Harrington is in our VIP wing." James nodded, not surprised that a billionaire would rate special treatment, even in their small county hospital. He waited awkwardly in the lobby, his hat in his hands, until a security guard appeared and introduced himself. "Mr. Wilson, I'm Officer Rodriguez. If you'll follow me, please." The elevator took them to the top floor of the hospital, where the atmosphere was noticeably different. The harsh fluorescent lighting of the lower floors was replaced with softer, warmer lights. The floor was carpeted instead of tiled, and the nurse's station looked more like a hotel concierge desk. James felt even more out of place. A doctor in a white coat approached, hand extended. "Mr. Wilson, I'm Dr. Taylor, Mr. Harrington's physician." Thank you for coming. He's been quite anxious to meet you properly. How's he doing? James asked, genuinely concerned. Remarkably well, considering the accident. Concussion, 3 broken ribs, a fractured tibia, and various cuts and bruises. It could have been much worse. The doctor's expression became serious. If you hadn't pulled him from that vehicle when you did, we wouldn't be having this conversation. James shrugged uncomfortably. Just happened to be there. Dr. Taylor smiled. Nevertheless, now Mr. Harrington is still recovering, so please keep the visit relatively brief. Though I must say he's been more animated since learning you were coming than he has since he arrived. The doctor led James to a private room at the end of the hallway. The door was open, and inside, James could see a hospital bed surrounded by machines, flowers, and get-well cards. In the bed, propped up against several pillows, was the man James had pulled from the wreckage. In the daylight, clean and conscious, Richard Harrington looked both more fragile and more commanding than he had during the rescue. His silver hair was combed neatly, and though his face was bruised and a bandage covered the cut on his forehead, his blue eyes were sharp and alert. His right leg was elevated and encased in a cast, and an IV line ran into his left arm. Those keen eyes found James immediately. "Mr. Wilson," Harrington said, his voice stronger than James expected. "Please, come in." James entered the room, suddenly feeling like he should have listened to Darlene about the tie. "Mr. Harrington, good to see you awake." "Thanks to you," Harrington replied, gesturing to a chair beside the bed with his uninjured hand. "Please sit down, and call me Richard." James sat, placing his hat on his knee. "How are you feeling?" "Like I drove off a cliff and hit every tree on the way down," Richard answered with a wry smile that turned into a slight wince. "Laughing hurts. Breathing hurts. But I'm alive, which I understand is entirely due to your quick thinking." James shook his head. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Richard said firmly. "They wouldn't have. I've been told the police estimate I'd been down there for at least an hour before you found me. How many cars passed by in that time? Dozens, probably. But you not only stopped, you climbed down a steep ravine, pulled me from a burning car, and carried me to safety." His eyes held James's steadily. "The police officer who took your statement was quite detailed." James shifted uncomfortably under the praise. "Just did what needed doing." Richard studied him for a moment, then changed tack. "Tell me about yourself, Mr. Wilson, James. You're a farmer, I understand." The conversation shifted to more comfortable ground for James as he explained about his farm. The crops he grew, the livestock he raised, the generations of his family that had worked the same land. Richard asked thoughtful questions that showed he was genuinely interested, not just making small talk. As James described the challenges facing small family farms these days, he was surprised by how attentively the billionaire listened. There was no condescension, no impatience, just genuine curiosity and what seemed like real concern. "So the bank loan comes due in 6 months. And honestly, I'm not sure how we're going to manage it," James found himself admitting, surprised by his own candor. "Last year's drought hit us hard, and the big corporate farms keep driving prices down." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "Farming is perhaps the most essential industry in the world, yet we've created a system that makes it nearly impossible for family operations to survive." He gestured to the window, where the spring sunshine streamed in. "I grew up in a small farming community in Iowa. My father was a school teacher, not a farmer, but all my friends' parents worked the land. I've watched those same farms get swallowed up by corporations one by one over the decades." This surprised James. The billionaire tech mogul didn't strike him as someone with rural roots. "That's partly why I wanted to meet you," Richard continued. "Not just to thank you, though I am eternally grateful, but because when they told me you were a farmer who stopped to help a stranger, it reminded me of the community I grew up in. People looked out for each other there. It seems that spirit isn't entirely lost." A nurse appeared at the door with a tray of medication, giving James a pointed look that suggested the visit should be wrapping up. "I should let you rest," James said, standing up. "Wait," Richard said, reaching for a business card on his bedside table and handing it to James. "This has my personal number. I'd like to continue our conversation when I'm out of here. And I'd like to see your farm if you wouldn't mind showing me around sometime." James took the card, surprised. "You want to visit my farm?" Richard's smile was genuine. "Very much so. I've been so caught up in the tech world for decades that I've lost touch with what's important." Nearly dying has a way of clarifying one's thinking. He extended his hand to James. Besides, I owe you my life. The least I can do is learn more about it. James shook the offered hand, noting the strength in the older man's grip despite his injuries. You're welcome any time, Mr. Harrington. Richard, he corrected. And I'll hold you to that invitation. As James left the hospital and drove back to his farm, the business card tucked safely in his shirt pocket, he couldn't help but wonder if he'd ever actually hear from Richard Harrington again. It seemed unlikely that their worlds would continue to intersect once the billionaire returned to his normal life of board meetings and private jets. Yet something about the man's sincerity had seemed genuine. There had been a look in those sharp, blue eyes, a clarity that perhaps did come from nearly dying. That made James think this might not be the last he'd hear from Richard Harrington, after all. 2 weeks after their meeting at the hospital, James had almost convinced himself that Richard Harrington had forgotten all about him. The business card remained in his dresser drawer untouched. He hadn't expected the billionaire to actually follow through on his interest in the farm. People said all sorts of things from hospital beds that they didn't really mean. It was a warm Saturday morning, and James was in the field checking his corn seedlings when Darlene's voice called out to him from across the yard.
Even at a distance, he could hear the excitement in her tone. "James!"
You need to come up to the house. Right now. He straightened up, his back protesting after hours of bending to inspect the young plants. Something in his wife's voice made him move quickly despite the ache in his muscles. As he approached the farmhouse, he noticed an unfamiliar black SUV parked in their driveway. It was sleek and expensive looking, clearly out of place beside his old pickup truck. Standing on the front porch talking to Darlene was Richard Harrington. The billionaire looked remarkably different from the injured man in the hospital bed. Though he still walked with the help of a cane, and James could see the outline of bandages beneath his light blue button-up shirt, he stood tall and looked surprisingly at ease on the simple farmhouse porch. He wore casual pants and loafers that probably cost more than James's entire wardrobe but somehow didn't seem pretentious. "Mr. Wilson," Richard called out, raising his free hand in greeting. "I hope you don't mind me dropping by unannounced. I was finally released from medical supervision yesterday and wanted to take you up on that tour." James wiped his hands on his jeans as he approached, surprised, but not displeased. "Not at all. Welcome to our farm." Darlene was practically vibrating with excitement. She'd already offered Richard coffee and homemade muffins, which he'd graciously accepted. Her initial shock at finding a billionaire on her doorstep had quickly given way to her natural hospitality. "Your wife has been telling me about the history of your property," Richard said as James joined them on the porch. 3 generations, is that right?" James nodded, accepting the mug of coffee Darlene handed him. "My grandfather bought this place after World War II. He'd grown up farming and wanted to get back to it after what he'd seen in Europe." "A wise man," Richard said, his eyes scanning the property with genuine interest. There's something healing about working the land. The 3 of them sat on the porch for a while, talking easily despite the vast differences in their lives. Richard asked thoughtful questions about the farm, the challenges they faced, and their hopes for the future. James was struck again by the man's sincerity. There was no condescension in his manner, just genuine curiosity and respect. After they finished their coffee, James offered to show Richard around the property. Darlene insisted on packing some water bottles and snacks, concerned about their guest overexerting himself so soon after his accident. "I'm supposed to be getting exercise," Richard assured her with a warm smile. "Doctor's orders, though I admit I might need to take it slow." James, mindful of Richard's injuries and the cane he relied on, suggested they take the small utility vehicle he used for getting around the farm. "Not as fancy as your SUV," he said with a slight smile, "but it'll get us where we need to go without too much walking for you." As they drove slowly around the property, James pointed out the different fields, explaining what was planted where and why. He showed Richard the small herd of cattle, the chicken coop, and the old barn that had been standing since his grandfather's time. Throughout it all, Richard listened attentively, occasionally sharing memories from his own childhood visits to farms in Iowa. They stopped at the edge of a field where young corn plants were just beginning to reach toward the sky. The spring sun warmed their shoulders as a light breeze carried the scent of fresh earth and green growing things. "This is my favorite spot on the whole farm," James admitted, You can see almost everything from here. The fields, the house, the pond over yonder. My grandfather used to bring me here when I was just a boy. He'd say, "Remember, James, we don't own this land. We're just taking care of it for a little while." Richard nodded thoughtfully, leaning on his cane as he surveyed the view. Your grandfather was a wise man. That's a lesson many in business could stand to learn. He paused, his expression becoming more serious. You mentioned at the hospital that you're having financial difficulties. Would you be willing to tell me more about that? James hesitated, pride warring with practicality. He wasn't one to discuss money troubles, especially with someone he barely knew. But there was something about Richard that inspired trust. Farming's always been a tough business, James began slowly, but these last few years have been harder than most. The drought last summer meant we had to irrigate more, which drove up costs. Then prices fell at harvest time because the big corporate farms flooded the market. He gestured toward the western boundary of his property. And our neighbor sold out to Agricorp last year. They've been buying up all the small farms around here. Offered us a deal too, but he shook his head firmly. This land's been in my family for 3 generations. I don't want to be the one who lets it go. Richard listened without interrupting, his blue eyes taking in not just James's words, but the emotion behind them. What about your children? He asked. Do they want to continue the family tradition? A complicated expression crossed James's face. My son's studying agricultural science at the state university. He talks about coming back, bringing new ideas. My daughter's a nurse, like her mother. She loves the farm, but not the farming life. He smiled slightly. I just want to keep this place going long enough for my son to have the choice. They continued their tour, ending at the small pond where James and his family sometimes fished on summer evenings. Richard walked carefully to the edge, looking at the clear water reflecting the blue sky above. You have something special here, Richard said quietly. Something that can't be measured in dollars or quarterly reports, James nodded. That's what makes it so hard. The bank doesn't care about family history, or the feeling you get watching seeds you planted break through the soil. They just see numbers on a page. Richard turned to face him directly. James, I'd like to make you a proposition. Not charity, he added quickly, seeing the farmer's expression change. A partnership. What kind of partnership could a tech billionaire want with a struggling small farm? James asked skeptically. Richard smiled. One that benefits us both. I've been thinking a lot during my recovery, about what matters, about what I want to do with whatever time I have left. He gestured around them. Places like this are disappearing. The knowledge, the traditions, the connection to the land, it's being lost. I think that's a tragedy, he continued, his voice becoming more animated. What if we created a sustainable farming initiative, using traditional methods enhanced by appropriate technology, not replacing farmers with machines but supporting them, making it viable for family farms to continue? James listened, uncertain. And my farm would be what? A test case. A founding partner, Richard corrected. You know farming. I know business and technology. Together we might be able to create something that helps not just your farm, but others like it. The proposal hung in the air between them. James didn't respond immediately, taking time to consider what Richard was suggesting. Why? He finally asked. Why would you want to get involved in something like this? Richard's expression became more solemn. When you pulled me from that car, you didn't know who I was. You didn't stop to calculate what you might gain. You just saw someone who needed help and you acted. He looked out over the farm again. That meant something to me. It reminded me of values I grew up with but had somehow lost sight of along the way. He turned back to James. I have more money than I could spend in several lifetimes, but what I've been missing is purpose, a way to make a difference that matters. His voice grew quiet. Nearly dying has a way of clarifying one's priorities. James studied the older man, sensing his sincerity. I'd need to think about it. Talk to my family. Of course, Richard agreed readily. Take all the time you need. This isn't a decision to rush into. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small business card holder, extracting a card and handing it to James. This has all my contact information. When you're ready to talk more day or night, just call. As they walked back to the utility vehicle, a comfortable silence fell between them. Two men from vastly different worlds, brought together by chance, now contemplating a partnership neither could have imagined just weeks before. Back at the farmhouse, Darlene had prepared lunch, nothing fancy, just hearty sandwiches, fresh vegetables from their early garden, and homemade lemonade. Richard ate with obvious appreciation, complimenting her cooking in a way that made her blush with pleasure. As he prepared to leave, Richard shook James's hand firmly. "Thank you for showing me your farm. Whatever you decide about my proposal, I'm grateful for the experience." James nodded. "I'll be in touch." He and Darlene watched as the black SUV disappeared down their gravel driveway, its sleek outline somehow not seeming as out of place as it had earlier. "Well?" Darlene asked, turning to her husband with raised eyebrows. James looked out over the fields his grandfather had first plowed, that his father had tended, and that he had worked all his adult life. "I think," he said slowly, "that sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places." 6 months had passed since Richard Harrington first visited the Wilson farm. The summer heat had given way to autumn crispness, and the fields that had been newly planted during their first meeting were now ready for harvest. The corn stood tall and golden in the afternoon sunlight as a small group gathered at the edge of the property. James stood beside Richard, both men watching as a young woman from the local newspaper took photos of the new sign being unveiled at the entrance to the farm. The wooden sign, hand-carved by a local artisan, read, "Wilson Heritage Farm, founding member of the Rural Preservation Alliance." "Looks good," James said, nodding at the sign with quiet pride. He glanced at Richard, who was smiling broadly despite the slight chill in the air. The older man had recovered well from his injuries, though he still occasionally used a cane on days when his leg bothered him. "It does," Richard agreed, "but not as good as your crops. The yield projections are even better than we hoped." After weeks of careful consideration and many discussions with Darlene and their children, James had decided to accept Richard's partnership proposal. What had begun as a simple idea had quickly blossomed into something neither of them had fully anticipated. The Rural Preservation Alliance was now a registered non-profit organization with Richard's substantial financial backing. Its mission was to help family farms remain viable through a combination of sustainable farming practices, technological innovation, and cooperative marketing strategies. The Wilson farm served as its flagship operation, implementing new approaches that respected traditional farming wisdom while embracing appropriate modern techniques. "Mr. Wilson, Mr. Harrington, could we get one more photo of you both by the sign?" called the young reporter, her camera ready. The two men moved into position, no longer awkward in each other's company after months of working together. Though they came from vastly different worlds, they had discovered a mutual respect and even friendship that transcended their backgrounds. "Make sure you get my good side," Richard joked, striking an exaggerated pose that made James chuckle. "If I'd known rescuing you would lead to all this media attention, I might have thought twice," James teased back, though both knew it wasn't true. After the photographer finished, the small gathering moved toward the barn, which had been renovated and now housed both traditional farm equipment and a state-of-the-art monitoring system that tracked soil conditions, weather patterns, and crop health. Solar panels gleamed on the south-facing roof, providing much of the electricity needed for the farm operations. Inside, a group of farmers from neighboring counties was already waiting. These were men and women James had known for years, many facing the same challenges he had: rising costs, pressure from corporate agriculture, and the uncertainties of weather and market prices. They looked around with interest at the changes that had come to the Wilson farm, some skeptical, others openly curious. Richard moved through the group with surprising ease for someone who had spent most of his life in boardrooms rather than barns. He had a genuine interest in their stories and concerns, and over the months, he had earned a measure of trust from even the most doubtful local farmers. "Folks, thank you for coming today," James began, standing at the front of the gathered crowd. He wasn't one for public speaking, but his deep voice carried naturally through the space. 6 months ago, I was just trying to hang on to this farm that's been in my family for 3 generations. Now, thanks to a strange twist of fate and this fella here," he nodded toward Richard, "we're trying something new, not just for my family but hopefully for all of you too." Richard stepped forward. "When James pulled me from that wrecked car, he didn't know who I was. He just saw someone who needed help, and he acted without hesitation. That kind of character, that kind of community spirit, it's something we can't afford to lose. And yet we're losing it farm by farm. as corporate agriculture pushes out family operations. He looked around at the gathered farmers, his expression serious. The Rural Preservation Alliance isn't charity. It's an investment in a way of life that matters, a way of life that connects us to the land and to each other. One of the older farmers raised his hand. This all sounds fine and good, but what exactly are you offering us? James answered, low-interest loans to help upgrade equipment and implement sustainable practices, shared resources for processing and distribution, technical support for those who want it, and most importantly, a cooperative marketing approach that lets us command better prices than any of us could get alone. Another farmer spoke up. And what's in it for him? She nodded toward Richard, skepticism clear in her voice. Richard didn't seem offended by the question. A fair one. I've made more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. What I don't have is a legacy that matters. When I nearly died in that accident, I realized I'd been measuring success all wrong. He gestured around the barn. This isn't about profit for me. It's about purpose. The discussion continued, questions coming from all directions. Some farmers signed up for the program on the spot, while others wanted time to think it over. Throughout it all, Jam, S. and Richard worked as a team, complementing each other's knowledge and approach. As the meeting wound down and people began to leave, James's son Thomas arrived from the university, his car raising dust on the long driveway. He was home for the weekend to help with the harvest and had brought along several classmates interested in sustainable agriculture. Dad, he called out, embracing James before shaking Richard's hand warmly. Sorry we're late. Professor Johnson had a million questions when I told him what you guys are doing here. Richard smiled at the young man who shared his father's strong build and thoughtful eyes. Your father's the real genius behind this. I'm just the money man, Thomas shook his head. From what I've heard, it's a true partnership. And it's exactly what I've been studying at school. How to blend traditional farming wisdom with new technology. He looked at his father with pride. You're becoming famous in my agricultural policy class, you know. James looked embarrassed but pleased. Well, let's not get carried away. We're just trying something different is all. As the young students explored the barn with its mix of old and new, James and Richard stepped outside into the golden afternoon light. The farm looked different now than it had 6 months ago. New equipment in the fields, solar panels on buildings, a small processing facility under construction near the old storage sheds. But the essence of the place remained unchanged, the connection to the land as strong as ever. I got a call from another investor yesterday, Richard said quietly. He's interested in expanding the alliance model to farms in the Midwest. Says there's a huge need there too. James nodded, watching a flock of birds wheel over the harvested section of the cornfield. Not surprised. What we're facing here isn't unique. We could really scale this thing up, Richard continued. Make a significant impact nationally. One farm at a time, James cautioned. That's been your strength in all this. You didn't try to change everything overnight. You listened. You learned. Richard smiled, acknowledging the truth in the words. I had a good teacher. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Two unlikely friends brought together by chance and kept together by shared purpose. You know, Richard said finally, when people hear this story, they focus on how you saved my life that day. But the truth is, I think you saved something much more important. James looked at him questioningly. You reminded me what matters, Richard explained. After decades of chasing success in the tech world, I'd forgotten the values I grew up with. You didn't just pull me from that car, James. You pulled me back to who I was supposed to be all along. James, never comfortable with grand statements, simply clasped Richard's shoulder in response. But the gesture conveyed what words could not: understanding, respect, friendship. From the barn came the sound of laughter as Thomas showed his classmates how the new monitoring system worked alongside traditional farming methods. Darlene emerged from the farmhouse carrying a tray of drinks for the visitors, her smile warm as she called out to James and Richard. The sun was beginning to lower toward the horizon, casting long shadows across fields that had been in the Wilson family for 3 generations and would now, against all odds, likely remain for generations more. I should probably help Darlene with those refreshments, James said, starting toward the house. And I should answer some of those students' questions, Richard agreed, falling into step beside him. They're the future of all this, after all. As they walked together toward the gathering of young people, the unlikely savior and the man he'd rescued, Neither could have imagined this outcome on that fateful spring morning. But sometimes rescue comes in unexpected forms, and sometimes saving a life leads to saving something far larger, a way of life, a community, a connection to the land that feeds us all. The Rural Preservation Alliance would go on to help hundreds of family farms across the country in the years that followed. But it all began with a simple act of kindness on a country road. When a black farmer stopped to help a stranger in need, unaware that he was a billionaire, unaware of how that single decision would transform not only 2 lives but countless others.